The sun beat down mercilessly on Parris Island, South Carolina, turning the parade ground into a furnace that tested the limits of human endurance. It was July 2018, and Charlie Company was in their 8th week of Marine Corps boot camp, that crucible where civilians are broken down and rebuilt into warriors. The recruits stood at attention in perfect formation, sweat streaming down their faces, not daring to move a muscle as their drill instructors prowled the ranks like hungry predators looking for the slightest weakness. At the edge of the field, sitting quietly on a weathered bench in the shade of the administrative building, was an old man. He looked to be in his late 70s, thin and weathered, with white hair cropped military short and hands that trembled slightly as they rested on a wooden cane. He wore simple clothes, khaki pants, and a white button-down shirt, and he watched the training with eyes that seemed to see beyond what was happening in front of him, perhaps in the memories of his own past. If you believe in honoring those who served before us, hit that like button right now. And stay until the end, because what happens when someone recognizes this quiet old man will leave you absolutely speechless. The recruits had noticed him over the past few days. He'd started appearing during their training sessions, always sitting in the same spot, never saying a word. Some of the drill instructors nodded to him respectfully as they passed, but no one explained who he was or why he was there. In boot camp, you learn quickly not to ask questions about things that didn't directly concern your survival, so the recruits simply accepted his presence as another mystery in a place full of them. Recruit James Mitchell was in his 4th week, still adjusting to the brutal reality of Marine training. At 22, he joined the Corps to prove something to himself, to escape a life that had been going nowhere in a small town in Ohio. His grandfather had been a Marine, killed in action in Vietnam before James was born, and James carried that legacy like a weight on his shoulders. He wanted to be worthy of the title his grandfather had earned. During a brief water break, as the recruit stood at ease for the first time in 2 hours, James found himself near the bench where the old man sat. Up close, James could see the man's face was deeply lined, carved by decades of sun and wind and experiences James couldn't imagine. But what caught his attention was the man's forearm, visible where his sleeve had been rolled up against the heat. There, faded but unmistakable, was a tattoo. It showed the Marine Corps' eagle, globe, and anchor, but beneath it were words that made James' blood run cold. Key San 1968, and below that, a series of names, perhaps a dozen, inked in small, precise letters. James froze. Every American who knew anything about military history knew about Khe Sanh. It was one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the Vietnam War, a 77-day siege where surrounded Marines held their ground against overwhelming North Vietnamese forces. The casualty rates had been devastating. The Battle of Khe Sanh was where boys became legends or became casualties, often both. The old man noticed James staring. He looked up, and for a moment their eyes met. The old man's eyes were blue, faded like old denim, but there was something in them that made James straighten unconsciously to attention. "You know what Khe Sanh was, son?" the old man asked quietly. His voice was rough, like gravel tumbling in a metal bucket. "Yes, sir," James replied automatically, even though the man wore no uniform or rank. "My grandfather was a Marine. He talked about it before he died. Said it was hell on earth." The old man nodded slowly. "Your grandfather was right." He gestured to the bench. "You got a minute before they run you ragged again." James glanced at his drill instructor, who was watching but made no move to stop him. "Yes, sir." James sat, careful to maintain proper posture, even in this informal setting. Up close, he could read the names tattooed beneath the Khe Sanh inscription: Rodriguez, Thompson, Williams, Chin O'Brien, and others. 12 names in total. "Those were my men," the old man said, following James's gaze. "My fire team. I was a corporal then, 20 years old, and convinced I was invincible." He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "We all were." "What happened?" James asked quietly. The old man was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from somewhere far away. January 21st, 1968. The siege had just begun. We were tasked with defending Hill 861, one of the outlying positions. The NVA came at us in waves, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. We held that hill for 3 days before reinforcements could reach us. He paused, his hands tightening on the cane. I was the only one from my fire team who walked off that hill. These 12 men, he touched the tattoo gently. They're the reason I'm sitting here today. Every one of them died making sure someone else lived. James felt his throat tighten. I'm sorry, sir. Don't be sorry, the old man said firmly. Be worthy. That's all any of them would ask. He looked at James with those faded blue eyes. You know why I come here? To this training ground? No, sir. The old man gestured toward the recruits running drills in the blazing heat. Because I see them, he said softly. Rodriguez, Thompson, Williams, all of them. They were just kids when they died. Younger than you. They never got to have families, careers, grandchildren. They never got to grow old and sit on benches in the shade. So I come here and I watch the new ones train, and I remember what they're training for. I remember what it costs. The drill instructor's whistle blew, signaling the end of the break. James stood quickly. Sir, can I ask your name? The old man extended a weathered hand. Walter Brennan. Corporal, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines. Though most people just call me Walt, James shook his hand, feeling the strength still there despite the tremor. Recruit James Mitchell, sir. It's an honor. The honor's mine, recruit. Now get back to your training. And Mitchell, he called as James started to walk away. James turned back. Make it count. Whatever you do with this uniform, make it count. Too many good men died earning the right to wear it. Over the next few weeks, James saw Walt regularly. The old man came to watch training several times a week, always sitting on the same bench, always quiet and observant. James learned from the other Marines that Walt was something of a legend on Parris Island. He'd received the Navy Cross for his actions at Key Sand, though he never talked about it. After the war, he'd become a teacher, spent 40 years educating kids in rural South Carolina, never making a big deal about his service. But 5 years ago, Walt's wife had died, and he found himself alone with too many memories and too much silence. So he'd started coming to Parris Island with permission from the base commander who'd served under someone who'd served under Walt. He'd sit and watch, a living connection to the Corps' history, a reminder of what the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor really meant. One evening, near the end of boot camp, the drill instructors did something unusual. They called the entire company to formation and marched them to an indoor assembly hall. There, sitting in a chair on the stage, was Walt. The base commander stood beside him, along with several officers James didn't recognize. The commander spoke to the assembled recruits. Today, you have the privilege of hearing from a true Marine hero. Corporal Walter Brennan served in Vietnam, survived one of the most brutal sieges in American military history, and earned the Navy Cross for conspicuous gallantry. He's agreed to share his story with you. If this story is moving you, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. We share stories about heroes, sacrifice, and the values that make us stronger. We honor those who served and remind ourselves why their sacrifices matter. Your subscription helps us continue this important work. Walt stood slowly, waving off assistants, and approached the microphone. He looked out at the sea of young faces, and James saw emotion flicker across the old man's weathered features. I'm not going to tell you war is glorious, Walt began, his voice steady despite his age. I am not going to romanticize what happened on Hill 861. What I'm going to tell you is the truth. War is ugly. It's terrifying. It's watching your friends die and not being able to save them. It's making impossible choices and living with the consequences for the rest of your life. He paused, letting the words sink in. But I'm also going to tell you about courage. Real courage isn't the absence of fear. It's being absolutely terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway. Rodriguez was scared. So was Thompson. So was I. But when the moment came, when our brothers needed us, we didn't run. We stood together. Walt spent the next hour telling stories. Not grand tales of heroism, but small human moments. Rodriguez sharing his last cigarette before the attack. Thompson singing off-key to calm everyone's nerves. Williams, barely 18, writing letters to a girl back home he'd never get to marry. He talked about the sounds, the smells, the weight of an M16, the way time seemed to stretch and compress during combat. But mostly, he talked about brotherhood. About how those 12 men had become his family in the truest sense. About how they looked after each other, sacrificed for each other, and in the end, died for each other. When Walt finished, the hall was completely silent. Grown men, hardened drill instructors who'd seen combat themselves, had tears in their eyes. The recruits sat transfixed, understanding for perhaps the first time what they were really training for. "You're not just learning to fight," Walt said softly. "You're learning to be part of something bigger than yourselves. You're joining a brotherhood that stretches back centuries, built on the sacrifices of men and women who believed something was worth fighting for." He touched his tattooed forearm. "I carry these names with me every day, not because I'm haunted by them, but because I'm honored by them. They made me who I am." Walt's eyes found James in the crowd. "And one day, some of you will carry names too. Maybe not tattooed on your skin, but written on your hearts. Brothers and sisters you served with, people who shaped you. That's the real burden of the uniform. Not the weight of the gear, but the weight of the relationships. The people who count on you and the people you count on." He straightened as much as his old body would allow. "So when you graduate, when you earn the title of Marine, remember it's not just about you. It's about everyone who wore this uniform before you, and everyone who will wear it after. It's about being worthy of the sacrifice others made so you could stand here today. Make it count. Make every single day count." The applause that followed was thunderous. The recruits stood as one, and even the drill instructors joined in the standing ovation. Walt smiled, that same sad smile James had seen on the bench, and slowly made his way off the stage. After the assembly, James found Walt outside, sitting on his familiar bench in the gathering dusk. "Sir, can I ask you something?" Walt nodded. "Of course. Do you ever regret it? Going to Vietnam? Losing your friends?" Walt was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "I regret that they died. I regret that they never got to live the lives they deserve. But do I regret serving? Do I regret standing beside them? Never. Not for 1 second." He looked at James. "Those 12 men taught me what really matters. Loyalty, courage, love, though we never have called it that. They taught me that some things are worth fighting for, worth dying for. And they taught me that the way you honor the dead is by living well, by being the person they believed you could be." James felt something shift inside him, a crystallization of purpose he'd been searching for since he arrived at Parris Island. "Thank you, sir, for sharing your story, for reminding us what this means." Walt extended his hand one more time. "You're going to be a good Marine, Mitchell, I can tell. Just remember, courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and choosing to act anyway. And brotherhood isn't about never disagreeing. It's about standing together when it matters most." 3 weeks later, James graduated boot camp. He earned the title of United States Marine in a ceremony that made his family weep with pride. Walt was there, sitting in the same spot he always did, watching another generation step forward to carry the legacy. Years later, when James deployed to Afghanistan, he got a tattoo of his own. It wasn't as elaborate as Walt's, but it meant just as much. It showed the eagle, globe, and anchor, and beneath it, 2 words, "Worth it," because that's what Walt had taught him. That service, sacrifice, brotherhood, all of it was worth it. Not because war was good, but because standing for something, fighting alongside brothers and sisters for a cause bigger than yourself, that was what gave life meaning. Walt passed away in 2022 at the age of 81. His funeral was attended by hundreds of Marines spanning generations. They came from across the country to honor the quiet old man who sat on a bench and reminded them why they served. James was there, now a sergeant himself, and he stood at attention as they folded the flag that had draped Walt's casket. In Walt's effects, They found journals spanning 50 years. Page after page of memories, reflections on his service, his lost brothers, the young Marines he'd watched train. And on the last page, written in a shaking hand just days before he died, were these words: "I've lived a good life. Not because of what I did, but because of who I did it with. Rodriguez, Thompson, Williams, Chen, O'Brien, and all the others. They're still with me. They'll always be with me. And now, finally, I get to see them again." Semper Fi. This story reminds us that heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's an old man on a bench, quietly carrying the names of the fallen, making sure new generations understand the cost of freedom. Sometimes it's a young recruit learning that courage and fear can coexist, that brotherhood is the truest form of strength. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs to hear about sacrifice, service, and the bonds that transcend time. Leave a comment honoring a veteran you know or sharing how someone's service impacted your life. These stories matter. These memories matter. And the people who carried them matter. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for remembering that freedom isn't free. It's paid for by men and women like Walt Brennan and the 12 names on his arm. Until next time, honor the fallen by living well. Semper Fidelis. Always faithful.